we realize and start to face the horrible truth that everything we've been told is a lie. Today, I'm no longer surprised, and I truly believe that every facet of our reality has been affected, manipulated, infiltrated, and poisoned with half-truths. It's not always completely a lie, but the best way to tell a lie is you keep a little bit of the truth and then you're surrounded by a lot of falsifications. Everything in creation spins and vibrates. Everything has its own prime resonance frequency. Everything. And this is why once we can identify a prime resonance frequency of a bacterium or an atom or whatever it is, or a soccer field, we can then manipulate that object with its prime resonance frequency. In Christianity, it's the word. In Hinduism, it's Om. The Egyptians believed the universe was sung into creation, and the original people of Australia, not the Aboriginal, so it's the original people of Australia believed that the world was created with 3 sacred songs. And then we have the phenomenal similarities between the 6 days of creation in Christianity and the word that created everything, the 6 aspects of Om, and the 6 aspects of the all-seeing eye of Horus, and you start seeing the connections between all these ancient cultures and the creation stories. Sound is the source of all creation. Sound and resonance is responsible for everything. By now you should know that sound manifests physical form, and this is the most basic example. I just cannot get enough of it. I can watch it millions of times. Every frequency has its own specific shape, a prime resonance frequency. Are you only looking at a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional effect? I think he actually uses rice on a metal plate here. So the original people of Australia have a creation story that says time began when the supernatural beings awoke and broke through the surface of the earth. So imagine the surface of the earth being something like this, that metal plate being the surface of the earth, and the supernatural beings broke through the surface of the earth, and they created the surface of the earth with 3 sacred songs. This is from Hans Jenny's brilliant video, Cymatics. This is powder on a metal plate. It's not a liquid or a jelly, it's powder. You can see landscapes being formed here over extended periods of time. Mountains can form, valleys, volcanoes, all to do with the sound of the earth coming out of the earth. Now watch that. And then Eric Larson is the guy that created the Cymoscope, and this is when you can suddenly see how the human voice has potential to create infinitely. That with our voice we have the potential to create everything and anything we can imagine. That we are indeed creators. And remember, every thought you have also has a frequency and a vibration, has a resonance, just like your voice. And some of these pictures, the images of this Cymoscope images, tell us that it was these sounds, the images of the sound, that actually inspired religious symbols. That beautiful cross in a circle at the center of some of these cymatic photographs give us a very clear indication that the creators of the religious symbols knew exactly what they were talking about, that the source of creation is sound itself. And that takes us to what sound does. Sound pretty much does everything you can imagine because it's a source of creation. And this brings us to using sound as a tool in technology. Sound creates light. It's very obvious. We know that God said, let there be light, and you can do this yourself by attaching a speaker to an LED light and see what happens. Royal Raymond Rife, you should know by now, that the man that found the cure for all disease with sound and resonance. They were converted to electric impulses, and sound continues to amaze us. Sound can levitate. By now, you would have seen this many times, just a very quick idea that sound actually does levitate things, but this is not how the ancients used to levitate the very big, heavy objects. This is a very different technique used here. This is just pressure waves that can levitate things, very light objects, but it does give you the ability to imagine that sound actually levitates. Sound creates hurricanes. There are two guys in 2003 that lodged a patent to create hurricanes out of sound, believe it or not. And I believe they were granted their patent to create hurricanes. And maybe this is how they create the weather for us, without us even realizing it. And this is where we start getting into the real understanding of some of the masters. And no matter how I look at it, how much research I do, I keep coming back to one guy that stands head and shoulders above all other researchers and inventors of, I don't know, for how many centuries. And that guy's name is Nikola Tesla. He says, if you want to find out the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. Picture of an electron. There's a picture taken about a decade ago. They tell us that this is a light beam or electron riding a light beam. Can you see a particle anywhere in this picture? No, there's no particle. They're resonant waves, and yet they tell us it's an electron. Can you see how we get brainwashed? So this is what Nikola Tesla has to say about the electron from an interview in 1928. On the whole subject of matter, in fact, Dr. Tesla holds the view that are startlingly original. He disagrees with the concept of atomic theory of matter and does not believe in the existence of an electron as pictured by science. This is a shock to the system, because we all think, oh, electrons are real. And you start seeing an agenda being developed here, an agenda being developed by mainstream universities, the mainstream scientific fraternity, under the guidance of those that are trying to lie to us and make us believe things that are not so. This is what Einstein has to say about the electrons. In the theoretical treatment of these electrons, we are faced with the difficulty that electrodynamic theory itself is unable to give an account of their nature. For since electrical masses constituting the electron would necessarily be scattered under the influence of their mutual repulsion unless there are forces of another kind operating between them, the nature of which has hitherto remained obscure to us. So he says, he doesn't quite understand how electrons come into being. And he tells us that millions of people all over the world are being fooled by the non-existing electron, and he has a lot more to say about this. And you start seeing that scientists and inventors and researchers over the last 200 years have been vehemently opposed to this whole concept of an electron and the atomic structure that have been forced down our throats and through all our educational institutions, that we just take for granted and we accept because we believe the guys that teach us this to be smart and they're not lying to us. We just accept the stuff. So what are the stone circles all about? By now you can see that clearly we're dealing with cymatic patterns. Very obvious we're dealing with cymatic patterns. That's what every stone circle is. It's just a representation of the sound frequency that comes out of the earth at that specific point. That's what this is all about.
Now let's touch upon the pre-religious age of enlightenment, when people sat down and spoke about the Creator without certain affixed images to its person and its principle. When you speak about pre-religion, you speak about an age of reason. You speak about building pyramids. You speak about people space traveling without leaving their bodies. You speak about visiting other planets and other dimensional time zones of consciousness. You speak of a time when people knew you can't build a pyramid of that size and be at war. What have you done to your workforce? You have to sacrifice them to fight. Civilizations such as Sumer, Babylon, Kemet, so-called Lemuria, all civilizations that were up on Mars, these civilizations needed time a time of great peace, a time to observe the procession of equinoxes. That don't come with you trying to fight off somebody at your borders, constantly thinking about your security. That comes from reflection. That comes from getting a good night's sleep. That comes from eating idle food. You don't build pyramids being an idiot. You don't build pyramids being a fool. You don't build pyramids with this education. There was a time when man possessed the greatest knowledge about the cause and creation of things. We call it the enlightened ones. We call them the enlightened time. And their knowledge was called the ancient wisdom. It wasn't called Christianity. It wasn't called Buddhism. It wasn't called Shintoism. It wasn't called Islam. It was called the ancient wisdom. Because it was a thinking dynamic and a postulating dynamic that grew with the knowledge that it used as its base. It didn't stagnate. Like all things that grow and evolve, so did knowledge. With reasoning uncorrupted by false theologies, they were able to study reality and thus arrive at truth.
This is deep. The New Testament, all this is forgotten now. We're taught that Christianity was a new revelation of truth, and its founders enlightened men and saints. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Ignorance is the soil in which religions grow, and Christianity is no exception. The New Testament itself calls the disciples unlearned and ignorant men, and the Jewish judges before whom their converts were brought pronounced them as idiots or idiotai, from which we get the word idiots. Still later, they were called fools in Christ. The Samaritan doctor called them Thartacs, T-H-A-R-T-A-Cs, at their period, in the reign of Thartak. Thartak was a Kemetic god of credulity and vulgar faith. He was portrayed as a man with a book, a cloak, and the head of an ass. He appears in the Old Testament as Tartak, one of the foreign gods that Solomon worshipped. If then the leaders of Christianity were ignorant and credulous, what of the masses that follow them? According to Leakey, they were, in all intellectual virtues, lower than any other period in history of mankind. They were made up mostly of the poor and the obscure, who were drawn into embrace the Gospels by an inner need, and whose low position on the social scale was a standing ground of reproach against the new religion from the side of its adversaries. It is only the religion of simpletons, the ignoble, the senseless, the slaves, and the womenfolk and children whom they wish to persuade to join their congregation or to persuade. This is what Celsus said. Celsus said, the rude and the menial masses who had hitherto been almost beneath the notice of the Greek and the Roman culture flocked into Christianity. Okay? And Hodges on Celsus said, he disliked them for their poverty and ignorance. They seemed to be presumptuous and impertinent people who undertook to be the teachers, having never learned. I will not sit in the seat of synods while geese and cranes confusedly wrangle, St. Gregory said. The many had begun to play with psychic and spiritual forces let loose from the mysteries, and the many went mad for a time and have not yet regained their senses. They had a full share of tumult, anarchy, injustice, and war. The primitive Christians were men whose ardor was fierce in proportion to their ignorance. These are all the people talking about who the Christians were back then. All this the apologists smothered in lies, and now our deluded preachers, teachers, playwrights, and scenarists paint these early Christians as the inspired few, fighting and dying for some true faith, brand the really inspired so-called pagans as ignoramuses. Tacitus calls Christianity pernicious superstition. The new faith is a perverse and extravagant superstition. This is what Pliny the Elder had said. A superstition vain and fanatic, said Suetonius. Today, a still deluded race looks upon these statements as pagan opposition to the light of the world, where they were just but deluded people of our spiritual understandings. Thus, whatever the early Christians suffered, it was not as the church asserts, because of the new gospel they preach, but because of the old absurdity they resurrected, belief in literal mythology. Okay, this is why the Christians were persecuted, because they were believing in literal mythology. Another son of God, number 16, had appeared miraculously, conceived of the virgin born. A third part of the Trinity walked about in Galilee. This was that blasphemy barbarously told. Porphyry had denounced, yet a band of fanatics called the Christians was actually demanding the restoration of this old religion, or this old fable. In other words, all of the Greek myths, all of the old Persian myths, they wanted to literalize it and say that God did walk the earth. And the people were telling them, listen, it's crazy.